Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the workshop on strengthening collaborative data capacity. We are going to be diving into a number of challenges today around using data. But first, we're going to pause and just briefly introduce ourselves as your hosts here. My name is Emily Rusca. I'm Director of State Policy and Strategy at Education Systems Center at Northern Illinois University. We are one of the 3 network organizers for the Illinois 60 by 25 network, and I'll hand it over to Charlie to introduce himself.
Thanks, Emily, and good morning, everyone. My name is Charlie Rosemond. I serve as Data and Outcomes Manager for Ed Systems.
And Helen.
Hi, my name is Helen Zhang. I'm with Advanced Illinois, where I'm a Senior Policy and Analytics Associate.
Awesome. And then I will actually, I know that their names are not on the slide, but I want to acknowledge 2 of our colleagues here who are helping out, like the wonderful team players they are. We've got Nora, who's going to be driving the reins when we do our breakout rooms later today to practice the data protocol, and Edith Jaguna, who is going to be one of our backup facilitators. Since we had a lot of people register for the session, we want to make sure everyone has kind of the right size of group here. I'm not going to run through all of these bullet points, but ultimately y'all are here because you are interested for some reason in data. Either you are already a data nerd yourself, or you know that using data are important for making decisions in your work. Data is one of the kind of core pillars of the work in the 60 by 25 network. When we are engaging with leadership communities around the state, we are often having conversations about what kinds of information do you need in order to inform your decision making. So we'll start first with some context and thinking about why using data is important as part of collective efforts that such as those that you all are engaged in. And then we will talk a little bit about how we make decisions about what kinds of protocols you can use, and then we'll actually practice using a protocol in a virtual context. So data can be used for a number of purposes, and some of those include kind of this internal and externally facing work. And so we like to talk about how using data can be both a window into looking out and seeing what's happening in your community or in your context, to understand how programs are being experienced or how programs are turning out. And also as a mirror to reflect on what our practices, what about our practices is being revealed by what we see out in the field. So it's really helpful to kind of keep that duality in mind as we consider how to use data. We also know, and many of you on the line here have probably experienced data being used as a hammer, where you're potentially being beaten over the head with a particular statistic or piece of information saying, why is this way? Why are students not graduating at better rates? Or why is this particular group of students not having the same outcomes as another group of students? We know that data can be used harshly like a hammer, but what we think and really emphasizes that using data is a way of shining a light on areas for improvement. I often say if your power goes out and it's dark in your house, you're not grabbing your hammer first, you're grabbing a flashlight to figure out where the problem is, where in the fuse box you need to do some work. So making sure that we're trying to use hammer as an effective tool, use data as an effective tool and not as a hammer necessarily, in order to drive positive change. And using data also helps us engage with our equity lens. If we don't know what the differences in experiences and outcomes are across different groups of students or community members at large, we won't be able to identify or diagnose any problems. And so we wanted to kind of highlight that, when we think about structuring opportunities for success for our community members through our education and workforce systems, we need to think about how are we identifying folks' experiences and understanding them in order to make decisions that will help people reach their full potential. And so when we think about using data, it comes as part of a broader picture. It's not simply just about looking at information, looking at data, looking at information, and all of a sudden we're able to make decisions that increase student achievement. It's part of a broader set of conditions and actions in order to drive those results, right? So we need to have a culture around using data. We need to have data that are of quality. We need to have folks at the table who have the capacity to engage with those data. And then that can lead to those different decision points and action steps. And part of what we're working on today and what we're modeling today is building that capacity and culture for using data. And so that's why we're focusing in on the protocol piece, because that helps build the individual and collective capacity to engage with the data, and that feeds into the culture. The other phrase we like to use is that we're building a collective data muscle. You wouldn't go into a gym and pick up really heavy dumbbells right off the bat. You would go in, pick up lighter dumbbells, and slowly build up that muscle so that you can lift heavier things. Using data is very similar in that way. Not everyone is very able to just launch in and immediately engage with data in a deep way, that it takes a lot of practice and modeling and building from the ground up and from the top down. There needs to be a culture of it, both top down and bottom up. It needs to be kind of an expectation that everyone on the team has something to contribute when it comes to thinking about data, in order to be able to really effectively use it for accountability and continuous improvement processes. And I'm going to kick to Charlie to talk about the levels of questions that we often think about when we think about engaging with data.
Thanks, Emily. So in general, there are these three kind of types or levels of questions. There are more observational. So what are you seeing in the data? Relational. Are there connections between what you're seeing, between those observations? For example, do observed differences appear related to gender, race, ethnicity? And then more inferential. So, what might be driving these connections? What might be the underlying factors? Say, the implementation of a program or particular policy that are driving what you're seeing. And so, to be clear, your ability and intent to move between these levels depends upon just the purpose of a data engagement, the data that are available. Just being for myself, often have to rely upon public data, but your organization or role could grant you access to different data. But then also your general expertise and data literacy. If you come from more of a research background, these kind of groupings of questions may seem familiar, and they have specific meanings and are associated with specific methods. But I think regardless, the levels and these data protocols in general, they're about moving from observing data to interpreting and better understanding those data, to ultimately using those data to inform decision-making and action.
Yeah, and there's value in all three levels. So,
Absolutely.
It's important to make sure that we're kind of hitting all of them.
And to that end, where can we look for data? As I noted, you may, if you work for a school district or in a school building, you're probably looking at different data than, say, someone in my role or a researcher. But we are very fortunate in Illinois to have access to some pretty rich public data sources. And so we have a handful listed here. The Illinois 60 by 25 network dashboard, it's a perk available to 60 by 25 network leadership communities, and it integrates disparate data tied to geographies identified by those communities. And so there are a number of indicators from cradle to career. The award-winning Illinois report card for K-12 data, the Illinois College to Career tool, which integrates higher education and early career outcomes by higher ed institution and also program of study at those institutions. And then the Illinois post-secondary profiles. This is essentially a post-secondary analog to the report card that offers data and information on higher ed institutions statewide. And there are others as well. And I can say that there are a lot of state level conversations about continuing to develop new resources and refine existing ones to ensure that the data that are available to stakeholders, available publicly to stakeholders, are rich and accurate and timely and available to inform decision making, like I mentioned. And I see, okay, Emily, great. Answer that
Yeah.
question. But
materials, recording and materials will be shared out via the conference website later today. And so keep an eye out for that.
Perfect. And so gonna hand it over to Helen.
Thanks, Charlie. So what we're hoping to do today with you guys is really talk about a few frameworks for thinking about how you have these conversations around data and start to build that collective data muscle, as well as go through a few specific protocols for those data conversations that can help as you start this work. We'll actually practice one of those in a bit, but wanted to start first with a few of these frameworks for how we think about these data conversations. So first is obviously starting with what are your goals and what are the levels of inquiry you're interested in. I think Charlie gave a great overview of that, so I'm not going to repeat that too much, but just really focusing on what do you want out of engaging with the data. And from there, thinking about how you design your facilitation of your data conversation. And you'll notice both in the specific protocols in the packet that we'll send around later, as well as the one that we'll practice, there are a few common things that we include in all those protocols. One is around how we facilitate data conversations. Another is just on materials and space considerations you need. And finally, just considerations for execution. So I'll start by talking a little bit about frameworks for thinking about how to facilitate effective conversations around data. First of all, is just the types of questions to consider. Again, I think Charlie gave us a really great overview around levels of inquiry and data. And from there, I think it's also a helpful framework for thinking out what types of questions do you want to ask to get to those levels of inquiry. So one framework we like to use is called ORID, just short for the first four letters, objective, reflective, interpretive, and decisional. And you'll notice they really align well with what those levels of inquiry are. So really starting with getting everybody on the same page with the same foundation of facts and trends that you're looking at to say, what does this data tell us? Then moving the conversation into reflection or relating that data to what are your experiences and what else do you know that reflects on the data itself. Third, kind of interpreting what that data means, inferring how you can connect that to your programs, your school, your district, your building, whatever it is you're working with. And then sometimes if you have the decisional authority wherever you are, or simply having some sort of response or action for what next steps and or commitments do you need to achieve your end goals. Sometimes the end goal can, thank you, Emily, also be around what further areas of inquiry you need. Sometimes it's further questions about like what other data you want to see before starting to make decisions around your programs or schools or wherever you are. The second thing we like to talk about when we think about facilitating data conversations is ways to effectively bring all voices in. And one way we like to do that is by ensuring that people have space to really make meaning of the data individually. So sometimes being in a room full of 30 people and just saying, go at it can be really intimidating. So ensuring that in any space you're in, there's some time for individual reflection. And then if there's a really large group, sometimes pair share or small group conversation can be helpful before bringing all parties back together into a large group to share out what we've thought about, learned, and want to reflect on. Another just bit on facilitating data conversations is on documentation. There are many different ways of documenting, as we'll see in some of the specific protocols. Sometimes we like put Post-its up on the gallery walk poster, or in the protocol today, we'll use stickies, or sometimes you'll have one person taking notes in a Word document. So lots of different ways to do that, but just another thing to think about with facilitating data conversations. And finally, in addition to all this meat, the framing is always really important. So really starting with the opening with sharing what those end goals are for the conversation, the context for conversation, and where you'll be going so people are prepared. And then at the end, always leaving time for a closing, so some sort of reflective space, reiterating any next steps and commitments, and just appreciations for all of your time, which we'll hope to reflect today. Next slide, please. And so here, and like we said, we'll share the PowerPoint out later. Just wanted to give a couple examples of how these types of questions that we often use to frame up our data protocol can be seen in different examples. So these two examples of different protocol that will be in your packet, such as the data gallery walk and placemat, you'll see how different questions that really relate to each of these different levels of inquiry and types of questions help facilitate through them. So things like, what are your immediate or general observations about the data relate to objective or observing questions? Things like, what is the story behind the data? How are you surprised? How does it connect to your experience? That's around relating to it, reflecting. And then what does the data mean for us? What do you think it suggests or what can you infer? That's really around interpreting it, connecting it to your organization or space. And decisional can be around what further information you need, what solutions you might want to start exploring. Next slide. So I mentioned 3 parts to kind of what we think about in terms of data conversations. The first was that facilitation. The second is kind of this material and space checklist. When you have those questions, oftentimes there's still other things that you need to help effectively facilitate. Things like slide decks, data packets, big posters of data charts can sometimes be helpful to make sure that people have a visual to help cue those conversations, to latch onto to really see what's going on, as well as notes. When we think about data engagement materials, oftentimes things like printed out templates or notepads for individuals to really make meaning on their own, help reflect and create that space can be helpful, as well as large group reflection materials. So having Post-its and shared spaces for people to add their notes. And of course, you're using pens, pencils, and markers. And finally, this is a little bit different given our virtual space, but in in-person times, making sure we're thinking about things like what are the possible seating arrangements. Some protocols can be harder if the space is only in classroom style versus round tables. If you have a deck, making sure there's audiovisual access. And obviously, we will talk a little bit more about digital forum in a little bit for using these data protocols and adapting them. Next slide. And the last thing I want to talk about was also just on executing these data protocols. So a few things to just think about with these various protocols and what you might want to use or ways in which you might want to adapt them. First is just thinking about group size. I know I mentioned on the first slide in terms of effective facilitation that individual meeting making, pair share and small group discussion and large group discussion is always helpful. Sometimes if your full group is already like 6 to 8 people, that pair share or small group discussion might not be necessary. And sometimes larger group sizes obviously might require more time to effectively facilitate larger spaces, different materials, et cetera. Another thing I just want to speak to is around group dynamics. This level of trust and prior experience collaborating can change the amount of time, for example, that you spend on that kind of inferring, interpretive, or relating space. Oftentimes, if everybody's really familiar with each other and you know, like, kind of your own organizational context, there's less time needed spent to like explain that. If you're thinking about who's at the table with level of authority, that can often change what decisional questions you're asking. And then prior experience with data can also change the amount of time you want to be allocating towards observing and getting everyone on the same page with what is happening in the data and what trends do we see. And I think we've seen, like in the past, that an effective number of facilitators is often something like 1 facilitator to, I don't know, usually less than 10 I think would be great, but depends on your own comfort level as well.
Right. So yeah, I mean, in summary, anchoring yourself in a goal, thinking about what levels of inquiry you're trying to get at, finding ways to be inclusive of all the folks who are at the table, making sure that you have the right materials, both in terms of setting up as well as being able to document and prepare folks for the engagement, and really focusing in on documenting next steps and assigning tasks so that you can continue to see that progress is really important. And thanks, Helen, for that overview. Charlie, did you want to touch briefly on this? And we will be sharing out, again, we'll be sharing out the materials, including the protocol packet, which provides greater detail about all of these things too.
Yeah, really quickly, you know, as each of us has, you know, expounded upon, you know, there are a number of different protocols. They're essentially different flavors of the same thing. There are different aspects that you need to consider with regards to facilitation. But it's really, as Helen noted, you know, what's our purpose here? You know, why are we engaging with data? What are we, you know, trying to better understand, and where are we going with these data? So, you know, again, these descriptions are available in the packet, and we'll be sharing all materials. But there are just so many protocols out there, and if you all have any others that, you know, have been proven successful in your own context, feel free to add them to the chat. We kind of have a living list of protocols for the network, but yeah, there are just a lot out there, and it's It's all about the underlying purpose versus necessarily the specific protocol.
Yeah, and I think to Charlie's point, like most protocols are different flavors of the same kind of spirit of an activity, right? And so thinking about, okay, if we really are trying to build a shared understanding of a general context, maybe we need to be staying at that observational or maybe in relational level of questions. And so what protocol makes the most sense for that context? The other thing we want to touch on briefly that Helen mentioned is we recognize that as we are currently experiencing with all of you in this room right now, we're having to figure out how to do this virtually, and it's hard. It's certainly challenging, but there are ways of doing it. And really, again, when we anchor ourselves in that purpose and in those levels of inquiry and figuring out how we can kind of reach those purposes and levels of inquiry through various methodologies, there are ways of adapting to a virtual context. And I know Mary Perkins is on the line from Elgin, and she's experienced that directly with Charlie and myself recently and working through the very protocol that we will all be practicing in just a moment here. But really, when we're thinking about adapting to a virtual context, if you're trying to kind of reach those end goals, think about what resources you already have at your fingertips or platforms that you already use in your community. So if you are a district that is a Google-based district, Google Jamboard is probably going to work out well. Folks may have some comfort level with it. There are communities that use platforms like Mural or Padlet or Microsoft Teams or Miro. You know, think about what sort of whiteboards are available to you in the digital platforms that you already have. And those can be just kind of helpful collaborative spaces. Ultimately, what you're trying to find is something that allows you to be able to, in a virtual context, have individual reflection time and then document those thinkings and those observations and those lessons somewhere that everyone can see. And it can be as simple as sending out a PDF of data visuals, which we will share a link to when we get into our breakout sessions to practice using one of these protocols in a Jamboard context, and then hopping onto a Zoom to discuss. But again, just kind of keeping those principles in mind of building from those different levels of inquiry, as well as building from individual levels of reflection and smaller groups of reflection, depending on how big your overall group is. But to Helen's point earlier, generally groups of 10 or smaller are typically the most effective. You can go up a little bit more than that, but it gets a little bit clunky, particularly in a virtual context. When we've offered this workshop before, we've always had to say, this isn't how we would recommend doing it in real life, because the groups have been like 15 to 20 people. But, you know, just keeping in mind, like the smaller the group, the more rich the discussion and the more generative the discussion you can probably have, because you're going to be able to have the most touch points with the most people. So I think I've already spoken to most of this, but again, it's still really important to document takeaways and next steps. It's important to hit on all of those levels of consideration that Helen really thoughtfully outlined earlier, even if it's in a virtual context. You're just simply doing it in a slightly different way, which is just like what we're doing with pretty much everything these days. Any thoughts or reflections or questions as well? Thanks, Sam, for that feedback in the chat about kind of preparing for similar conversations. That seemed to be a theme in a couple of different contexts. There were a few different people who are are imminently about to embark on these kinds of engagements. Glad you enjoyed having a structure to look at the data. And as mentioned earlier, the protocol packets will have a few different protocols in them. And I think one thing I mentioned in my small group is that, the protocol packet describes methodology for in-person, as well as includes the considerations we've described earlier today about translating it to a virtual context. You could also take a look at a protocol in that packet and say, I like these questions, and I'm going to use them in the same way that we just did the here's what, so what now, but in a Jamboard, right? So the placemat protocol, for example, has 5 questions. You could do a Jamboard with 5 slides with 5 Jamboards and go through those questions instead of the here's what, so what now, what framework, if it resonates more with you. I'm glad that folks found it to be a useful protocol. Hopefully what we've been able to do a little bit of today is demystify some of this data engagement. We know that there are folks who spend all of their time in data and who are part of internal research teams, institutional research teams, et cetera. And then there are lots of folks who are being asked to use data and don't necessarily know where to start. And we're trying to provide some of those tools that you can use as a starting point and then figure out what feels right for your community. Dorletta, thanks for this comment about kind of that the protocol itself takes the pressure out of the situation. And I couldn't agree more that it provides a structure and it provides a framework through which all of you can engage in the same data so that everyone is kind of equally valued in terms of interpreting what those data might mean. So with that, I mean, we will, I'll throw this up just in case anyone wants to share any reflections about how it might relate to your work or any takeaways you might have. But otherwise, just wanted to say thank you all very much for being a part of this. Thank you to Helen and Charlie and Nora for also being kind of on the back end on all of this. But would welcome any final reflections from the group and just really appreciate all of your time today.
I have a question. Will
Sure.
the Jamboard Google tool that we used be also accessible for us to use? Because I think that's a great way to have these type of data conversations.
Yeah, anyone can create a Jamboard if you have a Google account. And we can send, I think it's just jamboard.google.com. So if one of my co-hosts here wants to drop that link in the chat, you can just create a Jamboard at any time. One thing I will note that you probably got noted in your small group is that it's really easy to accidentally delete everything from a Jamboard. So just to be careful not to click the clear frame button. But it's a great tool to play around with, certainly. We've found it to be a really generally easy to use and effective tool for sure.
Emily, so you guys tend to do a similar session each year with 60 by 2025, and every single year I walk away with new ways to engage around data that is just so impactful. And I guess I just wondered, have I missed opportunities like throughout the year, not just at conference, where you guys present this type of work, because you just make data so accessible and like really it's just beyond measure, like compared to any other group.
That's very wonderful to hear. We've presented at a couple of conferences. We've presented at the College Changes Everything conference. My guess is that we'll probably do it again this year. Usually when we present it in those contexts, it's pretty much the same presentation. So you're not necessarily missing anything new in that regard. We did obviously, since you've been a part of it, I can say, you probably noticed that we've made a lot of changes this year, not only delivering it in a virtual context, but also thinking about what that meant for what we wanted to share with you all. But definitely always happy to talk more about what might be useful as a support for you and your work as part of a leadership community, in particular, how we as network organizers can provide more in-depth support. At Ed Systems, we've done a number of kind of more in-depth data workshops that are really contextualized by community, and that's been tied to different areas of work. I mentioned Elgin earlier. We had a few sessions to talk through their data. Charlie and I have engaged with other communities through other grants that we have as an organization. And so we're kind of always open to finding out if there are ways to provide that direct support in ways that are useful. So would be happy to connect after the fact.
I think there's one in the chat, Emily, and thanks, Mitch, around do you usually give the same amount of time to every like type of question, or like the 3 steps and here's what, so what, now what?
That's a great question, yeah.
I think it totally depends. I think also in the protocol packet, there are suggested times given to them. I know, Emily, you're a little more familiar with that particular one, but I think when we're thinking about group considerations, like one of the slides earlier, things like if you have people who are more comfortable with data versus less comfortable with data, you may adjust the amount of time for observation, or here's what, up or down.
Mm-hmm.
It's who your group adjust that timing as needed.
And sorry, and it depends upon the data as well.
Yeah.
I mean, something more state level. I mean, there's a lot there, but it's a bit higher level versus something specific to your district where there's a ton of domain expertise and experience. You'll immediately hit, the now what and the more meaty conversations sooner. So agree completely with Helen.
One other thing I'll just note is that as a facilitator, and I am not always good at this, but sometimes it's really important to kind of offer space to like be flexible in terms of that timing, right? So you maybe have gone in saying, okay, we're only going to spend 5 minutes in this portion. But when you're in it, you might find that people are seeming not to be ready for the next step. And so saying, like, show of fingers, how many more minutes do you need with this stage? And allowing for that feedback from the participants and making a judgment call from there, for sure. All right. Well, thank you all so much for your time. This has been a really wonderful session, and we look forward to staying engaged with all of you.